Okay, back to putting the front wheel on, part 2, before being interrupted by Bob the Cannon. Even though I shut the back door, they still decided to come in and say, "Hey, what's going on? What you doing?" Like I said, set the wheel off of its stand, set the bike down. You need a 14 millimeter socket and a 14 millimeter wrench, and tighten it just enough that about 40 foot-pounds, it's not going to come off. And even if the nut did come loose, the retainer on the left side and right side, well, depending on which way you're facing, would hold the axle in there. It'd be a good idea to get your handy dandy 10 millimeter wrench and socket. Make sure your brake hardware is all attached. And there I go with the seasonal allergies again. Make sure your brake hardware is tight. Where's my wrench to lock that down with? There we go. If you notice, the brake arm can actually travel a little bit. After you ride the bike for the first 2 or 3 rides, the brake shoes will actually seat into the drum and cause a little small wear pattern. So at first the brakes will feel fine, then they feel a little spongy, and you're going to have to go back and readjust those brakes to make them just a little bit tighter. And the trick is just put a floor jack underneath it, spin the wheel, adjust the brakes until it's tight enough, so that it's not dragging on the shoes, but yet it's firm enough of a grip on the handlebars up top. The fender usually comes wrapped in plastic. This one did not, but fortunately it wasn't scratched or dinged in any way in shipping, except a little factory dirt. Tighten these 2 nuts here. Just your handy number 2 screwdriver. But not completely tight, because you're going to do some adjustments as you hang the fender. Here's on the back side of the bike. This little tab is supposed to be straight up. You can just bend that with a pair of pliers, or if you got plumber fingers like me, you can adjust it with your hands. Attach the center nut. That's the basket retainer. You want the fender as high as possible to deflect rain, debris, what have you. Attach it with a 6 millimeter bolt. It's got a 10 millimeter head on it. I highly recommend that you put a lock nut behind it. Or for that matter, any fasteners on the bike. It has very basic suspension, rear shocks, and spring-loaded front forks. It does vibrate, just like anything that's a motorcycle. It's going to shake and vibrate, so it'd be a good idea to put lock nuts, double nuts, and blue Loctite. But for the sake of brevity on this video, I'm just putting it together dry. I'll go back through this thing one more time and put the appropriate amount of Loctite on there. Anyway, there's a lock nut behind here. You want to line the fender up as straight as possible before you lock it down. So put a wrench on the front, put a socket on the back. Now would be a good time, since you don't have the basket in the way, to line up your horn. It's just a 10 millimeter nut. Hold it as straight as possible. Start it off a little bit, so when you tighten it, it brings it up straight. A little sheet metal bracket that it's held together with. Go ahead and pre-tighten these 2 bolts here for the basket. You can see it needs a little bit of alignment there. It's not necessarily straight, so it'd be a good idea to tighten these nuts first and do a little bending on it. Sometimes this happens in shipping. Whatever you do, don't turn the bike on its side in packing, because you'll definitely end up with 1 or more things like this bent. That's straight enough. When I get the nuts and bolts in there, there's a way of aligning the basket so it looks true and follows straight with the bike. You might even have to bend out and straighten out a little bit. It's just truth in advertising. And you can see on the side of the fender there's a metal rail that goes down into the, if you can see this right, there's the thread to hold there. Sometimes there's maybe a little bit of welding spatter in there. You may have to clean the threads out with a bolt first. Sometimes you get, or they got a little aggressive on the painting. They just painted over the entire frame. They didn't put anything in to protect the threads from getting an excessive amount of paint. But if it's stiff, back it off, try it again, clean the threads out. And you can't see this, but I'm going to put a lock nut on the back side and then fix it with a wrench and continue to torque it down with a socket wrench on the other side. That way it doesn't come off and get caught up in your spokes or anything like that. And then do the same for the other side. Hold this in so you're not pushing it against the bolt. Get the thread started on it, and then you can drive it in with a wrench or a socket wrench. There's a bit of tension on that, so do a little come along with your thumb. Check the fender, make sure that it's lined up left and right, up and down. As you tighten the nuts, go around in a clockwise pattern, and then put your lock nuts on there. It takes some doing, but it can be done. You might want to use an offset wrench to get the lock nut in there, but it is possible. But for the sake of brevity on this video, it's pretty much a no-brainer. Check, make sure your electrical connectors for the horn is waterproofed or taped up or hot glued shut, and that takes care of the front wheel. And then you're able to roll the bike around. There are two Allen hex head nuts that hold the top of the triple tree together. They compress on the forks for the vertical alignment of the forks. Sometimes they ship these and they forget to tighten them all the way. So take your hex wrench, make sure that they're grabbing the forks good and tight. Turn the wheel to the right a little bit. You want these to bite just enough to hold the forks, but not over tight so you don't strip it. It's kind of hard to see, but it's a black-headed socket-headed Allen hex bolt. Oh, maybe 40 foot-pounds, maybe. To the left side and the right side. Let's make sure that the forks are aligned vertically. Pretty easy on this one. The caps are a good indicator how level it is. Even if you forgot to do this, there's still the large gooseneck nut, two bearings, and a bottom assembly. It holds the whole triple tree together. It wouldn't have come apart anyway. But I just noticed that these poor Chinese folks, they put them together so fast they forget to tighten the fasteners. I don't think they do it deliberately by oversight. So that completes the front wheel. The fastener kit, I just took the fasteners out and dumped them in a bowl or an egg carton. Usually handy. They include some zip ties to affix things like the rear brake light assembly. Meanwhile, the bike is still charging. We shipped them with 80-90% charge on them. Here's the rear brake handle. Here's the front brake handle. Another adjustment you can do is that this feed-through adjuster right here, I don't intend to mess with it because it's soft aluminum. There's a lock nut that goes with it. You want to make sure that that's tight up against the perch of your brake lever. That way that slot right there is not lining up with this slot, so the cable cannot come out and come loose while you're rolling down the road. Do the same thing for the rear brake. Turn this in so that slot is not lined up with that slot. I don't know what you would call the perch. And yes, these do break, and we do carry them in stock. On this year's model, they went ahead and affixed the turn signal beeper to the handlebars. This was bent over just a little bit. I straightened it out with a pair of pliers. It's just mild steel. I found it was really much easier to install the plastic on the rear if you rounded up these corners, which they did at the factory. If it's a straight 90, it makes it kind of hard for putting the rear plastic on. Now you can align the front wheel to the center line of the bike. Stand back, look at it. Yeah, it's pretty much straight and forward. So now you can align your handlebars to the center line of the bike. You don't have to be 100% accurate on it. Turn the bolt-toes finger tight, and then bring it up a couple inches, and then you can go ahead and wrench it down with a 12mm wrench. The same one that you use to lock the valve stem down with. I find these ratchet wrenches especially work handy. Just get it tight enough that you can start feeling some friction on the wrench. You'll see why when you go to put the plastic on later, that you may have to jiggle it a little bit to get it to line up. There's a slot in the rear plastic where you can feed a wrench through to tighten that up. It is made to break away, so that if you do get in a really nasty collision or go over the handlebars, it will break loose. But you do not want to adjust those handlebars with the that screw fully tight. It's a 14-inch long bolt with a friction adapter on the end of it that comes up inside the gooseneck, just like a standard bicycle. The next easiest thing to do on this is probably attach the pedals, the crank, and the seat. So you'll need a 14mm socket, a 15mm wrench for the pedals, small screwdriver. You can start on either side of the bike. Just remember, orientation wise, when I speak of left side of the bike, it's from the riding position, so I'm on the left side of the bike. There's a plastic cap here that always comes out. I always lose the thing. The crank is held on with a 14-inch nut, 14mm nut. It's a good idea to make sure that it's good and tight, which it is. The bicycle pedals, these are just common industry standard bicycle pedals. However, one is left-handed threaded, one is right-handed threaded. Left-handed thread goes on the left-hand side of the bike. Right-hand thread goes on the right-hand side of the bike. Because it's left-handed thread, it's opposite turning. So it'd be lefty-tighty, righty-loosey. So you can just turn the pedal a couple turns to get it started with your fingers. You don't necessarily need to put some Loctite on this side because as you pedal, you're always going to be trying to tighten the pedal into the crank. The crank is made out of mild steel. It's chrome plated. If you do crash and bend it, it is possible to take this off with a gear puller, put it in a vise, and straighten it out with a hammer. We do have cranks for sale. Dave's eBay store. So that takes care of the pedal and the crank on the left-hand side. It might behoove you to put some Loctite in there. The kickstand's pretty straightforward. It's got a retainer spring on it. The flip-down rack is held on by the axle nut. There's no nut for here yet. It's strong enough that it holds and supports the weight on its own. There's a lock spring for the stand. That unlocks the stand. You can rock the bike forward. It comes down off the stand. That you can just kick up with your foot. That locks the stand so it does not move. Notice the rear brake is just very similar to the front brake. It's got a cable, a retention spring, a post, and a lock nut in the back that you can adjust. You can grab the rear brake and see how much tension it has. You want to have the rear brake a little bit tighter than the front. That way if you do emergency grab the brakes, you don't have to worry about going over the handlebars. It's a 14 millimeter nut. You can adjust the rear brakes right now while we're down here on the floor. I've tried and concoct a lift, but I work on so many different bikes that I can't seem to come up with a standard stand for all these bikes. A cherry picker might work really good. Some nylon straps. Okay, see how the wheel just stopped, just barely dragging? Back it off a click. Maybe one more. I'm going to take it easy on my carpal tunnel fingers today. And actually use the socket wrench. Take it back one click. You could use a pair of pliers if you had to. Okay, the rear wheel. You always want to make sure that this thing stays inflated. It's 33 pounds just like the front. Make sure that this valve stem nut is locked down with a 12 millimeter wrench or deep socket if you got one. Because if you don't do this, here's what happens. You have low tire pressure. Okay. You don't think you need to inflate it. But when the bike starts rotating, it can generate up to 200 foot-pounds of torque, which is like twice your Honda Civic. What happens is the tire will rotate faster than the tube inside. The tube will literally get rotated inside there and tear this valve stem off, and you'll end up with a flat tire. Or it'll pinch the tube and flatten the tire. So as long as you keep the rear tire inflated and this valve stem locked, like 15 foot-pounds of torque, it'd be just fine. Make sure that the rear fender nut's locked, that your shocks are fixed with a 14 millimeter socket and are tight. This is a 7/8 inch nut compared to a 21 millimeter from last year, but they included an extra lock nut. Make sure that that's tight, but not so tight that you really compress the entire rear frame and pinch the brake housing against the hub motor. The hub motor is made out of aluminum. The steel is plated on the rim, so just keep it clean. Don't immerse the bike any higher than, I'd say, this lower brake cable to keep the water out of the brakes. It will drain and clean itself as necessary. And that's pretty much it on the left-hand side of the bike. Go through with the screwdriver, make sure that these screws holding the plastic together are tight. There's one down here in the middle. Make sure that that's affixed and tight. This cover can come off here if you ever need to remove the plastic to get at the wiring harness. This plastic cover here covers the controller and the main wiring harness where there's a fuse and some other items available. Normally you don't have to mess with anything in this whatsoever, but if you really wanted to take the cover off, there's one screw right here and there's another one matching on the other side. This whole plate comes out and you can take it off, and there's an access cover underneath there where the controller and the main wiring harness is. The harness actually goes down around through to the center pipe that's made up part of the J-bend of the frame and comes out just in front of the battery here. It is entirely possible if you took all the connectors off the wiring harness, you could pull the harness through the frame and then recable it when put the plastic plugs back on the end. But I don't see the reason why you'd ever need to overhaul something like that. It'd have to be something catastrophic, but just FYI. The seat is held on by a set of fasteners. There's this one here. You want to make sure that's tight with a hex wrench. There's two sizes available for that. This one's the bigger one. Make sure that it's torqued to about 30-40 foot-pounds. That's about right. This holds the rack, which you want to get these bolts that come with the bike. Sometimes they're attached on the bike, sometimes they're in the fastener kit. Don't ask me why, but I guess it depends on whether they're in a hurry or not. They just spun them on by hand. So you want to get these bolts out of the way before you start putting the seat and the rack on, so you don't catch the seat and rip it. Nice thing about that plastic tray there, makes a great little handy holder for your fasteners as you assemble the bike. If you ever get confused easy, it would be a good idea to get like an egg carton. You can separate out the fasteners as you take them off, or use a plastic bag with some tape on it. I know this sounds overly simplistic, but some people have never done mechanics before with more than 10 or 15 fasteners included. I'm on the right hand side of the bike now, so I'm just going to remove the same 3 bolts. They're identical. They're just 8mm shaft bolts. They have 10, 12, and 13mm heads on them, so you'll need a 13mm wrench and socket, 10mm wrench and socket, and the 12mm wrench or socket, depending on how you like to snake your arms in there. Now would be a good time since you're over here on the left hand side of the bike to check things like this. Is the axle nut tight? Is that chain guard plastic nut tight? There's a nut there. There are 1 nut there that holds the plastic on. There's a tag for the motor number. You can take that off. Is this fender nut tight? You might want to put a lock nut on it, or take it out, put some Loctite blue on it so your fender don't rattle loose. Now your shock nut's tight. You can check that with a 14mm socket. We can go ahead and put the pedal and the crank on this side. Let me get my tool. Like I said, you can put that plastic cap back in there, but I'm more likely to come out. It was already tight. Marked right hand side. We're on the right hand side of the bike. So obviously it follows the standard righty tighty, lefty loosey. Start with your fingers. Spin it on. Tighten it down with a 15mm wrench. You're done with the pedals on the right hand side. Now that you got that front fender on, now would be a good time to go ahead and make sure your mud flap lines up. You can also tighten down the screws that hold that bracket against the fender and make sure they're good and tight. Do the same thing for the rear. And tighten this down with a 15mm wrench. If you want to adjust the shocks, they're just like a motorcycle moped stock. They have a set of steps here. You take a spanner, not a screwdriver in there, a whole spanner, and you rotate the shock, and that'll extend the spring to allow more travel if you want a softer suspension. I tend to leave it right there at the stock. It seems to setting, it doesn't seem to need that much adjustment. Tighten up the rear fender bracket that holds the mud flap on. And guess what? Yeah, we found a loose nut. The nut that holds the rear reflector is loose. The rear taillight assembly, feed it down to the top of the bracket, because the seat and the metal bracket for it that it attaches to is going to be sitting here. The seat has 2 metal tines that go underneath this bracket here. Hopefully you can see this correctly. These metal tines slide underneath there and hold the front of the seat against the bike. There's a couple rubber bumpers here that line up on the frame. Make sure those are attached. Make sure all your nuts and bolts and staples holding it all together are good. The bike's affixed, the rear seat is affixed to the frame. The frame sits on the inside, these sit on the outside, acts like a spring, and you have to compress the whole thing down in order to get it to go down to put the bolts on. So the first thing you do is you line the seat up over the top of the frame. Hopefully you can see this in the camera angle. You got to kind of start out with the seat back a bit. It goes on. Those tines go underneath that metal bar. Then you rock it forward and then you push this down. It's kind of hard to explain, but it can be done. Just be gentle with it and don't rip the fabric on the underside. Maybe we can get better lighting here. So start up with the seat back a little bit, press down. You'll feel those tines come down underneath that bar as you push down. And then you can push the seat forward as